Late one night in 1994, in a quiet community in Michigan, a young woman went missing without warning, and authorities were left with nothing. More than 2 decades later, a single discovery changed everything, and it uncovered a truth no one was prepared for. The town of Holland, Michigan, is known for its beautiful spring tulip festivals and its rich, welcoming history. Located right on the edge of Lake Macatawa, it is a place where neighborhoods feel safe, where local business owners know their customers by their first names, and where the changing of the seasons dictates the rhythm of daily life. By the time November rolls around, the vibrant colors of autumn are stripped away by the freezing winds blowing in from Lake Michigan. The skis turn a heavy, permanent shade of gray, and the residents retreat into the warmth of their homes, lighting their fireplaces and preparing for the long, quiet winter. It was in this peaceful, insulated environment that Arthur and Caroline Pendelton built their life together. Arthur was a 28-year-old loan officer at a local community bank. He was a quiet, methodical, and deeply gentle man. He liked routines, he liked numbers, and he liked the simple comforts of a predictable life. Caroline, on the other hand, was his perfect opposite. At 26 years old, she was vibrant, deeply creative, and fiercely independent. She worked at a small, dusty antique shop downtown, specializing in the restoration of old, damaged books. She had a unique talent for taking things that were broken, forgotten, or falling apart, and carefully bringing them back to life. She spent her days with her hands covered in leather glue and bookbinding thread, humming softly to herself in the back room of the shop. When Arthur and Caroline met in the local library 3 years earlier, everyone in their lives agreed it was love at first sight. They balanced each other out in the most beautiful way. Arthur gave Caroline stability and a safe place to land, and Caroline brought color, laughter, and spontaneity into Arthur's rigid world. They purchased a small, cozy, 2-story craftsman house on a tree-lined street just a few miles from the water. Their home was always filled with the smell of brewing tea, vanilla candles, and the faint, comforting scent of old paper. To the outside world and to Arthur himself, their marriage was absolutely perfect. They never had loud arguments. They didn't struggle with massive financial debts. They didn't have any dark, lingering secrets that usually plague the couples featured on the evening news. They were simply two young people who were deeply in love, trying to build a quiet, happy future together. Saturday, November 12, 1994, was supposed to be a milestone for the couple. It was their 3rd wedding anniversary. Arthur had spent weeks planning the perfect evening. He had secretly saved up his bonuses from the bank to make a reservation at the Commodore, an upscale, highly exclusive seafood restaurant located right on the edge of the lake. It was the kind of place with dim, romantic lighting, white linen tablecloths, and a view of the water crashing against the icy docks outside. Caroline had been talking about wanting to go there for months. That evening, the weather in Holland was bitter and cold. A heavy lake-effect snowstorm was just beginning to move into the area, dusting the streets in a thin layer of white powder. Caroline spent an hour getting ready in their upstairs bedroom. When she finally walked down the wooden staircase, Arthur felt his breath catch in his throat, just as it had on the day they were married. She was wearing a beautiful, long-sleeved dark green velvet dress that perfectly matched her eyes. She wore her dark hair pulled back, fastened with a simple silver clip. She smiled warmly at him, looping her arm through his as he grabbed his heavy wool overcoat. They drove to the restaurant in Arthur's reliable sedan, listening to soft music on the radio, talking about their plans for the upcoming holidays. Caroline seemed incredibly happy. She talked about a rare, first-edition book she was currently restoring at the shop, her eyes lighting up with genuine passion. There was absolutely no sign of distress. There was no anxiety, no nervous energy, and no indication that anything was wrong. When they arrived at the Commodore, the restaurant was warm and bustling with couples escaping the freezing weather. The host seated them at a small, intimate table directly next to a large bay window overlooking the dark, icy lake. The dinner was wonderful. They shared a bottle of expensive wine, laughed about old memories, and toasted to the life they were building. Arthur felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He looked across the candlelit table at his young wife and felt completely, undeniably lucky. But as the waiter cleared their dinner plates and brought out a small slice of chocolate cake for dessert, something subtle but undeniable shifted in the atmosphere. Arthur was in the middle of telling a story about a funny interaction he had at the bank that week. He looked up, expecting Caroline to be smiling. Instead, she was staring completely blankly over his shoulder, looking out the large bay window at the restaurant's parking lot. The warm, vibrant color had completely drained from her face. She looked incredibly pale, almost as if she were going to be sick. Her eyes were wide, fixed on something in the dark, swirling snow outside. Arthur stopped talking and turned his head to look out the window. The parking lot was poorly lit, filled with a dozen cars covered in a thin layer of snow. He didn't see anyone standing out there. He didn't see anything unusual at all, just the cold wind blowing off the lake. He turned back to Caroline and gently touched her hand. Her skin was freezing cold. He asked her if she was feeling all right. Caroline physically jumped at his touch, as if she had been violently pulled out of a trance. She quickly looked down at the table, blinking rapidly, and let out a small, nervous laugh. She told Arthur that she just had a sudden, sharp headache. She blamed it on the rich food and the red wine. She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. The vibrant, relaxed woman who had walked into the restaurant just an hour earlier was completely gone, replaced by someone who looked like she wanted to crawl out of her own skin. Arthur, being the gentle and attentive husband he was, immediately asked the waiter for the check. He paid the bill, helped Caroline into her heavy winter coat, and walked her out to the car. The drive back to their house was entirely different from the drive there. The car was suffocatingly quiet. The soft music on the radio felt intrusive. Caroline sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead at the snowy road. But every few minutes, Arthur noticed her eyes darting to the side view mirror. She kept checking the reflection of the dark road behind them. When Arthur asked her if she thought someone was following them, she quickly shook her head, assuring him it was nothing, just a trick of the falling snow in the headlights. They pulled into their driveway just after 9 o'clock at night. The neighborhood was completely silent. The streetlights cast long, cold shadows across their front lawn. They walked inside, locking the heavy wooden front door behind them. The house was warm and comforting, just as they had left it. Hoping to lift her spirits and salvage the end of their anniversary, Arthur asked Caroline to sit on the living room couch. He walked over to his desk and pulled out a small, wrapped box he had been hiding in a drawer for weeks. He handed it to her, sitting beside her on the cushions. Caroline carefully peeled away the wrapping paper and opened the velvet box. Inside was a beautiful, custom-made silver locket. Arthur had secretly taken one of their wedding photographs and had it perfectly fitted inside the delicate piece of jewelry. Caroline looked down at the locket for a long time. Her hands began to tremble slightly. Then she looked up at Arthur, and to his surprise, her eyes were completely filled with tears. It wasn't a happy cry. It was a heavy, sorrowful kind of weeping. She threw her arms around Arthur's neck, hugging him tighter than she ever had before. She buried her face in his shoulder, her body shaking as she whispered a sentence that Arthur would replay in his mind every single night for the next 21 years. "You gave me the best years of my life, Arthur. I love you so much. Please never forget how much I love you." Arthur held her, stroking her hair, completely confused but assuming she was just overwhelmed with emotion and the lingering pain of her headache. He kissed her forehead, telling her he loved her too, and suggested they go upstairs to get some sleep. Caroline nodded, wiping her eyes. She placed the silver locket carefully on the coffee table, stood up, and walked up the wooden stairs. Arthur stayed downstairs for a few minutes. He turned off the living room lamps, checked the lock on the front door, and turned down the thermostat for the night. By the time he walked into their bedroom, Caroline was already under the heavy quilts, facing away from the door. Arthur changed into his pajamas, climbed into bed beside her, and turned off the bedside lamp. He was exhausted from the long week at the bank, and the warmth of the bed quickly pulled him into a deep, heavy sleep. The next morning, Sunday, November 13, Arthur woke up naturally. He didn't hear an alarm clock, and he didn't hear any loud noises. He just slowly opened his eyes, feeling the cold, gray morning light filtering through the bedroom curtains. He reached his arm out across the mattress to pull his wife closer. The spot next to him was completely empty, and the sheets were freezing cold. Arthur sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He assumed Caroline had woken up early to make tea, as she often did on Sunday mornings. He climbed out of bed, putting on his slippers, and walked out into the upstairs hallway. The house was completely silent. He called out her name, Caroline. There was no answer. Arthur walked into the master bathroom. It was empty. The towels were neatly folded on the rack, and Caroline's toothbrush was sitting exactly where it always did. He walked downstairs, his footsteps creaking on the wooden stairs. He expected to smell the comforting aroma of brewing chamomile tea and toasted bread. But the air in the house felt strange. It felt entirely heavy and incredibly cold. He walked into the living room. It was empty. He walked toward the back of the house, heading for the kitchen. As he stepped through the kitchen doorway, a blast of freezing winter wind hit him squarely in the chest. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Arthur stopped completely dead in his tracks, his heart suddenly hammering violently against his ribs. The heavy wooden back door of the kitchen, leading out to the snow-covered backyard, was completely wide open. The cold wind was howling through the doorway, blowing a thick layer of fresh, powdery snow directly onto the hardwood floor. Arthur rushed forward, his mind racing with terrifying possibilities. Had someone broken in? Had there been an intruder while he was sleeping? He slammed the back door shut, locking it with a shaking hand, and spun around to look at the kitchen. Nothing in the room was disturbed. The drawers were all closed. The knives were all perfectly resting in their wooden block. There were no muddy footprints on the floor, no broken glass, and no signs of a struggle whatsoever. Arthur looked at the coat rack near the pantry. Caroline's heavy winter coat, the one she had worn to the restaurant the night before, was still hanging there. Her leather purse was sitting neatly on the wooden bench directly below it. Her car keys were resting on the kitchen counter. If she had gone for a walk or run to the store, she would have taken her coat and her purse. It was 20 degrees outside. Arthur walked slowly toward the center kitchen island, his breathing becoming shallow and fast. Resting perfectly in the center of the clean marble countertop was the silver anniversary locket he had given her just hours before. The delicate clasp was completely unfastened, the chain laid out in a perfect, deliberate circle. But it was what was resting directly next to the silver locket that made Arthur's blood turn to ice. Sitting an inch away from the beautiful silver jewelry, staining the pristine white marble of the counter, was a single, perfect, dried drop of blood. Arthur stood completely frozen in the center of his kitchen, staring at the single drop of blood on the white marble counter. His mind violently rejected what his eyes were seeing. Just hours ago, his beautiful wife had been sitting right in front of him, smiling in the candlelight of a romantic restaurant. Now, her heavy winter coat was still hanging on the rack. The back door was blown wide open to the freezing winter wind, and a tiny, dark red stain was resting next to their anniversary gift. He slowly reached out, his hand shaking uncontrollably, and touched the drop of blood with the tip of his finger. It was completely dry. Panic, cold and suffocating, finally broke through his shock. Arthur ran to the kitchen wall phone, his fingers slipping against the plastic buttons as he dialed 911. When the emergency dispatcher answered, Arthur's voice cracked. He could barely form a coherent sentence. He just kept repeating his address, saying his wife was gone, that the door was open, and that there was blood on the counter. The dispatcher ordered him to step away from the kitchen, to absolutely not touch anything else, and to wait on the front porch for the officers to arrive. Within 10 minutes, the quiet, snow-covered suburban street was flashing with the red and blue lights of 3 police cruisers. 2 patrol officers ran up the driveway, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Arthur met them at the front door, his face completely pale, stammering as he pointed toward the kitchen. The officers immediately drew their flashlights, sweeping the bottom floor of the house. Finding no intruder, they radioed for a lead investigator and a forensic team. Detective Sterling arrived shortly after. He was a heavily built man with a thick winter coat and sharp, observant eyes. He had worked in Holland for over 15 years and was known for his calm, methodical approach to chaotic scenes. Sterling walked into the kitchen, taking careful note of the unclasped silver locket and the single drop of blood. He then turned his attention to the heavy wooden back door, which the patrol officers had left slightly ajar exactly as Arthur had found it. Sterling stepped out onto the snowy back porch, shining his powerful flashlight into the dark, frozen backyard. The snow had been falling steadily since 9 o'clock the previous evening, laying a perfect, undisturbed blanket of white powder over the grass. But right in the center of the yard, leading away from the wooden porch steps, was a single, terrifying trail. There was a clear set of footprints pressed deeply into the fresh snow, but they weren't the heavy treads of winter boots. They were the distinct, small impressions of bare human feet. Detective Sterling called Arthur to the doorway, asking him to identify the size of the prints. Arthur stared at the footprints, his stomach turning completely upside down. Caroline had a very small shoe size. The barefoot prints perfectly matched her feet. Sterling ordered the forensic team to carefully photograph the trail before the falling snow could cover it up entirely. The detectives followed the barefoot prints across the backyard. The trail did not show any signs of a struggle. There were no drag marks, no slips, and no extra footprints indicating someone had been walking beside her. It looked as though Caroline had simply unlocked the back door, taken off her shoes, and walked willingly into the freezing, 20-degree weather. The footprints led straight to the wooden gate at the very back of the property, which opened out into a dark, paved rear alleyway used for garbage collection. When the detectives opened the wooden gate and shined their flashlights into the alley, the barefoot footprints simply stopped. Right where the footprints ended, the thick snow in the alleyway had been crushed by the heavy, deep tread of vehicle tires. Someone had been waiting in a car with the engine running. Caroline had walked out of her warm house, completely barefoot in the dead of winter, and climbed directly into the passenger seat. The car had then sped away down the alley, leaving deep tracks that faded into the main road. By sunrise on Sunday morning, Arthur's perfectly quiet life had turned into an absolute nightmare. The police brought him down to the local station for heavy questioning. In any missing person case involving a married couple, the husband is automatically the prime suspect. Detective Sterling sat Arthur down in a small, sterile interrogation room and began picking apart his entire life. They asked about his finances, his marriage, and whether he had taken out any recent life insurance policies on Caroline. They asked if he had a violent temper or if Caroline had ever threatened to leave him. Arthur answered every single question through exhausted, heartbreaking tears. He handed over his bank statements, signed a waiver for them to search his entire house, and voluntarily submitted to a polygraph test. He begged Detective Sterling to focus on the restaurant. He explained how Caroline had looked out the large bay window at the Commodore, how all the color had drained from her face, and how terrified she had acted on the drive home. He insisted that she had seen someone in the parking lot. He told them about her strange, heavy embrace before bed, and the terrifying way she had asked him to never forget how much she loved him. The police immediately sent a team of investigators to the Commodore. They interviewed the host, the valet drivers, and the waiter who had served Arthur and Caroline. The waiter perfectly corroborated Arthur's story. He told the detectives that the couple seemed incredibly happy all night, until the very end of the meal. The waiter remembered seeing Caroline staring out the bay window, looking like she had just seen a ghost. But when the police reviewed the restaurant's security cameras from the parking lot, the footage was completely useless. The heavy lake-effect snowstorm had completely blurred the lenses, leaving nothing but a screen of white static and dark shadows. There was no way to see if anyone had been standing outside the window. When the forensic lab results came back on Tuesday, the mystery only deepened. The single drop of blood on the kitchen counter was an exact match for Caroline's blood type, but the medical examiner noted something incredibly strange. The shape and volume of the dried blood did not indicate a violent struggle. It wasn't a splatter, and it wasn't a smear. It was a perfect, tiny circle. The examiner concluded that the blood most likely came from a deliberate pinprick to the finger. It was highly probable that Caroline had used the sharp metal pin on the back of the silver anniversary locket to prick her own finger, deliberately squeezing a single drop of blood onto the marble counter before leaving the house. But why? Was she trying to leave a clue? Was she trying to fake a crime scene to buy herself time? Or was someone standing in her kitchen, forcing her to leave a terrifying message for her husband to find? The news of the missing young wife devastated the small town of Holland. Caroline's parents, Elias and Helen, drove in from out of state. When they arrived at Arthur's house, they didn't accuse him or point fingers. They simply held him in the living room and wept. They knew how deeply Arthur loved their daughter, and they knew Caroline would never just run away and abandon her family without a word. The local community organized massive search parties. Volunteers walked through the freezing woods near the lake, searching every ditch, every abandoned cabin, and every snowy ravine. The Coast Guard even brought in sonar equipment to scan the icy waters of Lake Makatawa, just in case the mystery vehicle had crashed into the water. They found absolutely nothing. Not a piece of clothing, not a shoe, and not a single trace of Caroline Pendelton. As the brutal Michigan winter dragged on, the initial adrenaline of the investigation slowly faded into a suffocating, heavy silence. The local news station stopped covering the story. The missing person flyers taped to the street lamps became buried under layers of ice and eventually tore away in the wind. Detective Sterling kept the case file on the very top of his desk, running down every single tip and rumor, but every lead turned into a solid brick wall. Caroline had no enemies. She had no secret credit cards, no secret lovers, and no hidden life that the police could find. She had simply evaporated into the winter night. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. By the spring of 1995, the snow finally began to melt, but Arthur was entirely broken. He was a ghost of the quiet, happy man he used to be. He had taken an extended leave of absence from the bank because he simply could not focus on numbers anymore. He spent his days sitting in the living room, staring at the empty spot on the couch where Caroline used to sit, turning the silver anniversary locket over and over in his hands. The house felt massive, empty, and painfully quiet. Knowing he could not live in a frozen museum of his own grief, Arthur finally decided he needed to start packing away some of Caroline's personal belongings. He couldn't bear to touch her clothes or her jewelry yet, so he decided to start with something smaller. He walked into the small spare bedroom on the second floor, which Caroline had converted into a miniature home studio for her book restoration work. The room smelled faintly of dry paper and leather glue. Her small wooden desk was cluttered with specialized tools, small jars of binding adhesive, and a magnifying glass. Stacked neatly on the corner of the desk were 3 heavy, antique books she had brought home from the shop to work on over the winter. Arthur grabbed a cardboard box and began gently placing her tools inside. He picked up the first antique book, intending to place it in the box. But as he lifted the heavy leather volume, he noticed something strange. The book felt remarkably light for its size. The cover was thick, dark brown leather, embossed with faded gold lettering, but the weight distribution was entirely wrong. Arthur sat down in Caroline's wooden desk chair and opened the cover. The book was completely hollow. Someone had used a razor blade to meticulously cut out the center of every single page, creating a perfect, rectangular secret compartment hidden entirely within the antique binding. Arthur's heart began to beat a little faster. He looked down into the hidden compartment, his breath catching in his throat as he realized what his gentle, innocent wife had been hiding from him. Resting at the very bottom of the hollowed-out book was a thick stack of $100 bills, bound tightly with a rubber band. It looked like at least $10,000 in completely untraceable cash. Directly next to the money was a small, folded piece of thick paper. Arthur picked it up with trembling fingers and unfolded it. It was a one-way bus ticket receipt. The ticket was departing from a station in downtown Chicago, heading all the way to Seattle, Washington. But it was the date and the name on the ticket that made the room start to spin. The ticket was scheduled for departure at noon on Sunday, November 13, 1994, the exact morning after their anniversary dinner, the exact morning he had woken up to find her missing. Caroline had planned to leave him. She had secretly purchased a ticket to completely vanish from his life. But the ticket was not purchased under the name Caroline Pendelton. Arthur reached back into the hollowed-out book and pulled out the final object resting in the secret compartment. It was a brand-new, officially laminated state driver's license. Arthur stared at the plastic card, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. The photograph on the license was undeniably Caroline. It was her face, her dark hair, and her beautiful green eyes. But the name printed next to the photograph in bold black ink was Julian Croft. The date of birth listed on the card made her 3 years older than Arthur thought she was, and the state of issue was not Michigan. It was Pennsylvania. Arthur sat in the quiet, dusty room, the reality of his entire marriage completely fracturing around him. His wife had not been randomly kidnapped by a stranger in the alley. She was a woman living under a stolen identity, hoarding a massive amount of hidden cash, and preparing to run away under the cover of their 3rd wedding anniversary. But the most terrifying question suddenly hit Arthur like a physical blow to the chest. If Caroline had everything perfectly prepared in this hidden book, and if she had planned to take a bus to Seattle the very next morning, then why did she leave the money and the fake ID behind? She hadn't run away. She had been found. The look of absolute terror on her face at the restaurant, the barefoot footprints in the freezing snow, and the single, deliberate drop of blood on the kitchen counter all painted a terrifying new picture. Caroline hadn't left on her own terms. Whoever she had been hiding from for all these years had finally caught up to her, and they had taken her into the dark before she ever had the chance to escape. Arthur did not wait for the morning. He grabbed the heavy, hollowed-out antique book, the thick stack of $100 bills, and the fake Pennsylvania driver's license, and he drove straight to the police station. Detective Sterling was working the late shift. When Arthur dumped the contents of the book onto the detective's metal desk, Sterling's exhausted eyes widened in absolute shock. For months, the police had been operating under the assumption that Caroline was a perfectly innocent, happy young wife who had been randomly targeted by a violent predator. But the hidden compartment in the book completely shattered that narrative. Sterling immediately ran the name, Julian Croft, through the national database. What he found sent a dark, terrifying chill through the investigation room. Julian Croft was a real person. She was a little girl who had been born in Pennsylvania, but she had tragically died in a car accident in 1972 when she was only 4 years old. Detective Sterling explained to a horrified Arthur that Caroline was using a classic, highly illegal technique known as ghosting. By assuming the identity of a deceased child who was born around the same year she was, Caroline had successfully applied for a real, state-issued driver's license. But acquiring a ghost identity was not something a simple book restorer from a quiet Michigan town could just figure out on her own. It required deep, dangerous connections in the criminal underworld. It meant Caroline was terrified of something massive, and she had been meticulously planning her escape for months. She had hoarded $10,000 in untraceable cash. She had built a completely new life on paper. She had bought a bus ticket to Seattle for the very morning after their anniversary. But the barefoot footprints in the snow and the single drop of blood proved that whoever she was running from had found her first. Desperate for answers, Arthur and Detective Sterling drove to the downtown antique shop where Caroline had worked. They hoped her boss might know something about the cash or the fake identity. When they arrived, the shop was in a state of total disarray. The owner, an older, quiet man named Silas Thorne, was busy packing his inventory into heavy cardboard boxes. Silas was a soft-spoken man in his late 50s, with graying hair and thick, wire-rimmed glasses. He had been Caroline's mentor, teaching her everything she knew about restoring damaged books. When Arthur asked him if he knew anything about Caroline's secrets, Silas looked completely heartbroken. He took off his glasses, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. He told the detective that Caroline was like a daughter to him, and that her disappearance had completely broken his heart. In fact, Silas explained that the grief was simply too much to bear. He couldn't stand being in the shop without her humming in the back room. He was permanently closing the business and moving back to the East Coast to retire near his extended family. Arthur felt a deep wave of sympathy for the older man. They shook hands, and Silas Thorne left Holland, Michigan, forever. With Silas gone, the fake ID leading to a dead child, and the massive snowy trail completely washed away by the spring rain, the investigation hit a permanent, unbreakable wall. Caroline Pendelton was officially declared a cold case. 21 long, agonizing years passed. The world moved forward into the year 2015. The internet connected the globe, payphones disappeared from the street corners, and the town of Holland grew larger and busier. But Arthur's life remained entirely frozen in time. He was now 49 years old. His dark hair had turned a distinguished shade of salt and pepper, and the bright, hopeful energy of his youth had been replaced by a quiet, heavy sorrow. Arthur had never moved out of their small craftsman house. He never remarried, and he rarely dated. He simply could not let go of the woman who had begged him to never forget how much she loved him on the night she vanished. The silver anniversary locket, perfectly preserving the single, dried drop of Caroline's blood, sat inside a small glass display box on his living room mantel. He had spent his entire adulthood living in the echoing silence of ambiguous loss. He was a man defined by a mystery that refused to be solved. On a freezing Tuesday night in November 2015, exactly 21 years after the anniversary dinner, Arthur was sitting alone in his living room. The television was playing softly in the background, but his attention was focused on his glowing laptop screen. He was idly scrolling through a social media news feed, trying to distract himself from the painful memories the week always brought. As he scrolled, a video automatically began to play on his screen. It was a short, documentary-style news feature that had recently gone viral, amassing millions of views across the country. The video was titled, "Small Coastal Town Rallies to Save Historic Bookstore After Devastating Storm." Arthur didn't normally pay attention to viral videos, but the footage of the small, rainy town in the Pacific Northwest caught his eye. The video narrated the story of a tight-knit community in Oak Haven, Washington, coming together to help repair a beloved local bookshop that had been severely damaged by heavy coastal flooding. The camera panned across a crowd of smiling volunteers carrying wooden planks and sweeping water out of the flooded storefront. And then the camera angle shifted. The focus of the video moved to the interior of the shop, zooming in on the woman who owned the store. She was sitting at a wooden workbench, carefully using a specialized tool to restore a water-damaged antique book. Arthur stopped breathing. The woman was older now. She looked to be in her late 40s. Her long dark hair was heavily streaked with silver, and she was wearing a pair of thick reading glasses. The years had clearly worn her down, leaving deep lines of exhaustion around her eyes. But as she worked on the binding of the book, she did something incredibly specific. Before opening the fragile cover, she tapped the spine of the book exactly 3 times with her index finger, and then gently blew the dust away. It was a nervous, methodical habit. It was the exact same habit Arthur had watched his wife perform hundreds of times in the spare bedroom of their house. Arthur's hands began to tremble violently. He moved his mouse and paused the video. The glowing screen froze on a close-up shot of the woman's face. He leaned closer to the laptop, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that actually hurt. He stared at the shape of her jaw, the slope of her nose, and the unmistakable, deep green color of her eyes behind the thick glasses. It was Caroline. After 21 years of believing she was buried in a shallow grave in the Michigan woods, Arthur was staring directly at his wife. She was alive. She was living in a small coastal town in Washington state, the exact state she had purchased a bus ticket for in 1994. A massive wave of conflicting emotions crashed over him. He felt an overwhelming, dizzying sense of relief that she wasn't dead, but immediately following the relief came a sharp, agonizing stab of betrayal. If she was alive and running a public bookstore, why had she never called him? Why did she leave the silver locket and the drop of blood? Did she stage the entire kidnapping just to get away from him? Had their entire marriage been a lie? Arthur knew he couldn't just call Detective Sterling. If Caroline was a criminal on the run, or if she had faked a crime scene to escape a marriage she hated, calling the police would send her straight to federal prison. Arthur needed to look her in the eyes. He needed to hear the truth from her own mouth before he involved the authorities. He didn't sleep a single minute that night. He packed a small duffel bag, grabbed his heavy winter coat, and drove to the nearest major airport. By Wednesday morning, Arthur was on a commercial flight heading straight to Seattle, Washington. If you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. The drive from the Seattle airport to the small coastal town of Oakhaven took nearly 3 hours. The landscape was beautiful but incredibly bleak. Tall, dark pine trees lined the winding 2-lane highway, and a heavy, freezing rain battered the windshield of his rental car. The sky was a thick, oppressive gray, casting a gloomy shadow over the isolated logging community. Arthur arrived in Oakhaven just as the sun was beginning to set. He drove slowly down the main street, his windshield wipers clicking rhythmically. He spotted the building from the viral video almost immediately. It was a rustic, 2-story wooden building with a newly painted sign hanging over the door that read, "The Harbor Bindery." Arthur pulled his rental car into a dark parking spot across the street, directly across from the warm, glowing windows of the bookshop. He turned off the engine, but kept the heater running to fight off the damp coastal cold. His palms were sweating. He stared through the rain-streaked glass, watching the silhouettes of a few customers moving around inside the store. He sat there for 2 agonizing hours, debating what to do. His mind raced with 100 different scenarios. Should he walk right through the front door? Should he wait until she was alone? What if she screamed when she saw him? At exactly 6 o'clock in the evening, the open sign in the front window flickered off. The last remaining customer walked out, putting up an umbrella and hurrying down the wet sidewalk. Arthur unbuckled his seatbelt, his hand resting on the door handle. He took a deep, shaky breath, preparing himself for the emotional collision of a lifetime. But just as he was about to push the car door open, the heavy front door of the bookstore swung outward. Caroline stepped out onto the sidewalk. She was wearing a thick wool coat, her head down against the freezing rain. Arthur felt tears immediately fill his eyes. It really was her. He was only 50 feet away from the woman he had never stopped loving. He pushed the car door open a few inches, but then he froze entirely. Caroline did not reach into her purse for her car keys. She didn't start walking down the sidewalk. Instead, she stood perfectly still under the awning, her head bowed in a posture of complete, terrifying submission. A heavy, dark SUV pulled up to the curb directly in front of the bookstore. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out into the rain. He was an older man, likely in his late 70s, walking with a slight limp but still carrying a massive, imposing physical presence. The man walked up to Caroline. He did not greet her with a hug or a smile. Instead, he reached out and grabbed her upper arm with a harsh, rigid, and deeply controlling grip. Caroline physically flinched, pulling her shoulders tight, refusing to look the man in the eyes. It wasn't the body language of a wife greeting her husband. It was the terrified, broken body language of a captive standing in front of her warden. The man turned his head to check the street, making sure the lock on the bookstore door was completely secured. As he turned, the pale yellow light from the street lamp illuminated his face perfectly through the pouring rain. Arthur's breath hitched in his throat. His entire body went completely cold, paralyzed by a shock so severe it felt like a physical heart attack. He hadn't seen the man in 21 years. His hair was entirely white now, and his face was deeply lined with age. But Arthur recognized him instantly. It was Silas Thorne, the quiet, grieving antique shop owner from Michigan. The gentle mentor who claimed he was closing his business and moving back to the East Coast because he was too heartbroken over Caroline's disappearance. Silas Thorne hadn't moved back east, and Caroline Pendelton hadn't run away. She had been living right here, trapped in plain sight, entirely under the control of the monster who had stolen her from her own kitchen 21 years ago. Arthur sat in his freezing rental car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. The shock of seeing Silas Thorne standing under the dim street lamp was so physically overwhelming that Arthur forgot how to breathe for a few agonizing seconds. His mind raced back to the dusty antique shop in Michigan 21 years ago. He remembered the older man taking off his wire-rimmed glasses, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief, and weeping over Caroline's disappearance. It had been an absolute, terrifying performance. The grieving mentor was actually the architect of the entire nightmare. Through the rain-streaked windshield, Arthur watched as Silas forcefully pushed Caroline into the passenger seat of the dark SUV. He slammed the heavy door shut, walked around to the driver's side, and climbed in. The headlights flared to life, cutting through the freezing coastal rain, and the vehicle pulled away from the curb, heading out of the small downtown area. Arthur's shock instantly transformed into a burning, desperate surge of adrenaline. He threw his rental car into drive, turned off his headlights so he wouldn't be easily spotted in their rearview mirror, and pulled out into the street. He kept a safe distance, staying about a block behind the red glow of their taillights. The drive took them away from the glowing storefronts of Oakhaven and deep into the rural, isolated logging roads that carved through the dense Washington forests. The rain poured down in heavy, relentless sheets, making the dark, winding roads incredibly dangerous. Arthur leaned forward, his chest tight, terrified of losing sight of the SUV in the heavy coastal fog. They drove for nearly 20 minutes, moving further and further away from civilization. The towering pine trees completely blocked out the moonlight, leaving the world pitch black. Finally, the brake lights of the SUV flashed brightly. Arthur quickly pulled his rental car over onto the soft, muddy shoulder of the road, killing the engine and sinking down into his seat. He watched through the fog as the dark SUV turned right, passing through a massive, heavy iron security gate that slowly swung open. The gate was flanked by tall stone pillars and topped with thick coils of razor wire. Once the SUV drove through, the iron gates clamped shut, and the vehicle disappeared down a long, winding gravel driveway into the woods. Arthur sat in the absolute darkness of his car. He was completely alone in the middle of a freezing forest, thousands of miles away from home. He had no weapon, no backup, and no cellular service in the deep woods to call the local police. If he drove back to town to find a phone, he risked Silas packing up and moving Caroline again, vanishing into the wind for another 2 decades. Arthur knew he could not leave. He had waited 21 years to find his wife, and he was not going to let her out of his sight for another second. He unbuckled his seatbelt, pulled up the heavy hood of his winter coat, and stepped out into the freezing, driving rain. The mud instantly soaked through his shoes as he walked toward the heavy iron gate. Knowing the entrance was likely covered by security cameras, Arthur moved off the main road and forced his way into the dense, thorny brush of the forest. He navigated the perimeter of the property, pushing through thick branches and climbing over rotting fallen trees, letting the heavy sound of the rain mask his footsteps. After 15 minutes of exhausting, freezing effort, he found a spot where a large pine tree had fallen against the security fence, crushing the razor wire flat. Arthur climbed over the slick, wet trunk of the tree and dropped down onto the muddy ground of Sela's Thorne's private compound. The property was massive. A long gravel driveway led up to a large, heavily fortified wooden cabin. The windows on the ground floor all had thick metal security bars bolted into the frames. About 50 yards away from the main house sat a large, detached steel warehouse, resembling an industrial garage or a massive storage shed. The entire place felt less like a home and much more like a high-security prison camp hidden in the deep woods. Arthur crept closer to the main house, hiding behind the trunk of a massive oak tree. The warm, yellow light from the kitchen window spilled out onto the dark, rainy lawn. Arthur slowly edged forward until he had a clear view inside. He saw Caroline standing at the kitchen sink. She was washing dishes, her head bowed in the exact same posture of total defeat he had seen outside the bookstore. Sela's was sitting at a large wooden dining table, drinking a glass of dark liquor. He was speaking to her, pointing a stern finger, his face twisted in a scowl. Arthur couldn't hear the words through the thick glass, but he could read the terrifying dynamic perfectly. This was not a partnership. Caroline was not a willing participant in whatever dark life Sela's had built out here. Every time Sela spoke, Caroline flinched slightly, scrubbing the dishes faster, terrified of making a mistake. She looked exhausted, broken, and entirely stripped of the bright, independent spirit Arthur had fallen in love with. Seeing the woman he loved treated like a prisoner made a hot wave of pure, absolute fury rise in Arthur's chest. He wanted to break the glass. He wanted to pull Sela's out of the chair and drag him into the freezing rain. But as Arthur watched, Sela's finished his drink, stood up, and pointed toward the back door. He said something sharp to Caroline, grabbed a ring of heavy keys from the counter, and walked out the back door of the kitchen. Arthur quickly ducked behind a stack of firewood on the back porch as Sela's walked right past him. The older man pulled his coat tight against the rain and walked heavily across the muddy lawn, heading directly for the large, detached steel warehouse. Sela's unlocked a heavy padlock on the warehouse door, stepped inside, and pulled the metal door shut behind him. Arthur knew this was his only chance. He needed to get Caroline out of the house right now, but as he stood up to approach the kitchen window, he noticed something strange. Through the glass, he saw Caroline walk over to the back door and try the handle. It didn't turn. Sela's had locked her inside. A heavy, double-cylinder deadbolt required a key from the inside to open. She was completely trapped in the house. Arthur realized that if he broke the window to get her out, the sound of shattering glass would echo across the quiet property, instantly alerting Sela's in the warehouse. He needed a key. He needed to figure out exactly what was going on in that detached building, find a way to secure a spare set of keys, or find something heavy enough to quickly and quietly pry the door open. Taking a massive risk, Arthur left the shadows of the back porch and sprinted across the dark, muddy lawn toward the steel warehouse. The rain masked the sound of his running footsteps. He reached the side of the metal building and pressed his back against the cold, corrugated steel. There was a small, frosted glass window near the back corner. Arthur carefully pulled himself up, wiping the grime away from the edge of the glass, and peered inside. The interior of the warehouse was brightly lit with long, harsh fluorescent tubes. It did not look like a garage, and it did not look like a storage shed. It looked exactly like a highly advanced, professional chemistry laboratory mixed with an antique printing press. Long metal tables were covered in specialized drying racks, chemical baths, and massive, heavy stacks of vintage, yellowed paper. Silas was sitting at a bright drafting table, carefully using a magnifying glass and an incredibly fine ink pen to perfectly trace a signature onto a piece of aged parchment. Arthur stared through the frosted glass, his mind racing as the massive, horrifying pieces of the 21-year-old puzzle finally slammed together. Silas Thorne wasn't just a humble antique shop owner in Michigan. He was a master counterfeiter. He was running a massive, highly illegal underground forgery ring. He was taking worthless old books, stripping the blank antique paper from the back pages, and using rare chemicals and vintage inks to perfectly forge lost historical documents, rare first-edition manuscripts, and incredibly valuable historical letters. He was selling fake antiquities to wealthy private collectors for millions of dollars. But Silas was an old man, and his hands were losing their steady grace. To pull off forgeries that could fool professional historians and international auction houses, Silas needed someone with absolute, brilliant perfection. He needed someone with a generational talent for restoring broken paper, matching antique binding, and understanding the chemistry of vintage ink. He needed Caroline. Arthur's heart broke into 1,000 pieces as the terrifying truth of 1994 finally made complete sense. Caroline hadn't been planning to leave Arthur. She had discovered what Silas was secretly doing in the back room of the Michigan antique shop. She had stumbled across the forgery ring. Knowing that Silas was a dangerous, wealthy criminal who could easily destroy her quiet life, Caroline was terrified to go to the local police. Instead, she had used her own skills to quietly acquire a fake Pennsylvania driver's license. She had secretly saved $10,000 from her paychecks. She had bought a bus ticket to Seattle, planning to flee across the country to protect Arthur from getting caught in the crossfire of Silas's dangerous criminal empire. But Silas had found out. He had discovered her hidden stash of cash and the fake ID before she could leave. He realized that if Caroline went to the police, his entire empire would collapse, but he also realized that she was much too valuable to kill. Her artistic talent was the only thing keeping his multi-million-dollar forgery business alive. So Silas had waited for the perfect night, the night of the heavy lake-effect snowstorm, the night of their anniversary. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Arthur backed away from the frosted window, his entire body trembling with a mixture of profound horror and absolute rage. Caroline had spent 21 years as a living, breathing slave to a master counterfeiter. Silas had isolated her on this rainy, heavily guarded property, forcing her to run a small, legitimate bookshop during the day as a front, and trapping her in this dark, chemical-smelling warehouse at night to forge millions of dollars worth of fake historical documents. She had sacrificed her entire life, enduring 2 decades of quiet, terrifying captivity, just to keep Arthur safe from the monster who held her leash. Arthur knew he couldn't just call the police now. Silas was heavily connected and deeply paranoid. If Arthur left to find a phone, Silas might notice the footprints in the mud, realize someone had been on the property, and move Caroline in the middle of the night. He would never see his wife again. The rescue had to happen right now, tonight, in the pouring rain. Arthur crept around the side of the steel warehouse, looking for anything he could use as a weapon or a pry bar. Near the massive sliding front doors, resting in a pile of discarded scrap metal, he found a heavy, rusted tire iron. It was solid, incredibly heavy, and exactly what he needed to force the deadbolt on the kitchen door. He gripped the cold iron bar tightly in his right hand. He took one last look at the locked metal door of the warehouse, ensuring Silas was still inside, focused on his forged documents. Arthur turned and sprinted back across the muddy lawn, heading straight for the warm, yellow light of the kitchen window. The rain was falling so hard now that it stung his face, but he didn't care. He was only 50 feet away from the woman he had loved every single day for 21 years. He reached the wooden back porch, stepping softly so the old wooden planks wouldn't creak. He stood up, pressing himself against the side of the house, and looked through the kitchen window. Caroline was still standing at the sink. Her hands were submerged in the warm, soapy water. Her shoulders were slumped, and she was staring blankly at the white porcelain, lost in the terrible, gray routine of her endless captivity. Arthur raised his hand. His fingers were shaking violently. He pressed his palm flat against the cold, wet glass of the window. He took a deep breath, fighting back a massive wave of tears, and tapped the glass 3 times. Caroline froze. The sound was faint, barely audible over the heavy rain, but it was enough to break her out of her trance. Slowly, nervously, she lifted her head and looked out the window into the dark, rainy night. Arthur stepped out of the shadows, letting the warm, yellow light from the kitchen fall directly onto his face. Inside the house, Caroline's eyes went completely wide. The soapy plate in her hand slipped from her fingers, crashing into the bottom of the sink and shattering into dozens of pieces. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth, muffling a desperate, agonizing gasp of pure shock. For a split second, 21 years of separation, terror, and heartbreak completely vanished. She stepped toward the locked wooden door, tears instantly flooding her eyes, reaching her hand out toward the glass. But just as Arthur raised the heavy iron pry bar to wedge it into the doorframe, a blindingly bright beam of light suddenly clicked on from the dark edge of the porch, shining directly into Arthur's eyes. A heavy, terrifyingly calm voice echoed over the sound of the freezing rain. "You always were a persistent man, Arthur," Silas Thorne said from the shadows, stepping up onto the wooden porch. Arthur completely froze, blinded by the heavy flashlight. He gripped the tire iron, turning slowly to face the older man. Silas stood perfectly still in the freezing rain. He didn't look surprised and he didn't look afraid. In his left hand, he held the heavy black flashlight. And in his right hand, pointed directly at Arthur's chest, was a loaded, heavy-caliber silver revolver. The blinding beam of the flashlight cut through the freezing coastal rain, completely illuminating Arthur against the side of the wooden house. The heavy, metallic click of the revolver's hammer being pulled back echoed over the sound of the storm. Arthur stood completely frozen, his right hand gripping the rusted iron tire iron so tightly that his fingers were entirely numb. Silas Thorne, the man who had played the role of a grieving, heartbroken mentor for over 2 decades, stood on the wooden porch looking terrifyingly calm. Silas slowly lowered the flashlight just enough so the blinding glare was out of Arthur's eyes, but he kept the heavy silver revolver aimed directly at Arthur's chest. The older man's face was deeply lined, his white hair plastered to his forehead by the rain, but his eyes were completely cold and empty of any human emotion. "I have motion sensors buried under the gravel at the main gate," Silas said, his voice smooth and disturbingly steady over the sound of the downpour. "When they triggered, I checked the cameras. I saw a man climbing over a crushed fence in a heavy winter coat. I didn't know it was you at first, Arthur. But then I looked out the window and saw you standing in the light. You look older, but you still have that same desperate look in your eyes." Inside the kitchen, Caroline was completely paralyzed. She stood by the shattered porcelain plate on the floor, her hands pressed tightly against the thick glass of the window, tears streaming down her face as she watched her husband standing at gunpoint. She pounded her fists against the locked window pane, screaming Arthur's name, but the thick, soundproofed glass and the howling wind completely drowned out her voice. Arthur's heart was hammering violently against his ribs. He knew he was standing inches away from death. But looking at the monster who had stolen 21 years of his life, 21 years of his wife's freedom, Arthur didn't feel fear. He only felt a massive, boiling surge of absolute rage. "You took her," Arthur yelled over the storm, his voice shaking with furious emotion. "You faked your grief. You closed your shop and you dragged her out here to be your slave. Why? Why didn't you just let her go?" Silas let out a dark, hollow laugh, taking a slow step forward on the wooden porch. "Because she was too brilliant to let go," Silas replied casually, as if he were discussing a business transaction. "She figured out my forgery operation in Michigan. She knew too much. When I found out she was planning to run away to Seattle, I knew I had to act. I let myself into your house that night while you were sleeping. I was going to kill you both right there in your bed and burn the house down to cover the evidence." Arthur felt the blood drain entirely from his face as Silas revealed the terrifying reality of their anniversary night. "But Caroline begged for your life," Silas continued, gesturing slightly with the heavy revolver. "She stood in the kitchen and bargained with me. She told me that if I let you live, she would come with me quietly. She promised to work for me forever, to forge every document I ever needed, as long as I never hurt you. She sacrificed her entire life to save yours, Arthur." Silas smiled, a cold, cruel expression that made Arthur's stomach turn. "But she was clever," Silas said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "While I was rushing her out the back door into the freezing snow, she secretly unclasped that silver locket you gave her. She used the sharp metal pin on the back to prick her own finger, leaving that single drop of blood on the counter. I didn't see her do it. She knew the police would find the blood. She knew they would treat it as a violent abduction. She forced a massive police investigation to ensure I couldn't just circle back and kill you later. She trapped herself in my world to keep you completely safe." Hearing the absolute truth of Caroline's unimaginable sacrifice completely broke Arthur's heart, but it also fueled an unstoppable adrenaline rush. His wife hadn't abandoned him. She had spent the last 21 years living in a nightmare simply to keep him breathing. Silas raised the revolver, aiming it directly at the center of Arthur's chest. "I let you live for 21 years because you believed the lie," Silas said coldly. "But you just couldn't let it go. And now I'm going to have to fix the mistake I made in 1994. Silas's finger tightened on the trigger. But inside the brightly lit kitchen, Caroline realized exactly what was about to happen. The years of quiet, terrifying submission completely evaporated. She was not going to let this monster take her husband away from her again. Caroline turned away from the window, grabbing the heaviest object she could find resting on the stove, a massive, solid cast-iron skillet. With a loud, desperate scream that tore her throat, Caroline swung the heavy iron skillet backward and smashed it violently into the center of the kitchen window. The thick glass exploded outward in a massive shower of sharp, glittering shards. The loud, sudden crash of breaking glass echoing over the porch caused Silas to physically flinch. For a fraction of a second, the older man's attention snapped toward the shattered window, and the barrel of the revolver drifted just an inch away from Arthur's chest. Arthur didn't think, he simply moved. Fueling every ounce of his strength into his right arm, Arthur lunged forward and swung the heavy, rusted tire iron like a baseball bat. The solid iron bar slammed brutally into Silas's right wrist. A loud, sickening crack echoed through the rain, and Silas let out a shout of agonizing pain. The heavy silver revolver flew out of his hand, clattering wildly across the wooden porch and falling off the edge into the dark mud. Before Silas could recover, Arthur tackled the older man with the full, devastating weight of 21 years of anger. They crashed onto the wet wooden planks of the porch. Silas was heavy and desperate, but he was an old man with a shattered wrist. Arthur pinned him firmly to the ground, pressing his forearm hard against Silas's throat, making sure the master counterfeiter could not move a single inch. Arthur looked up through the freezing rain, panting heavily, and yelled toward the shattered kitchen window. "Caroline, call the police. Call 911. Caroline was already moving. She grabbed the heavy black landline phone off the kitchen wall, her hands shaking violently, and dialed the emergency numbers. She screamed their location to the dispatcher, telling them there was an armed intruder and that they needed help immediately. For the next 10 minutes, Arthur did not move. He kept his entire body weight pressed against Sela's, ignoring the freezing rain soaking through his clothes. Sela's gasped for air, struggling weakly, but the fight had completely left him. The terrifying warden of the private compound had finally been broken. Soon, the quiet, isolated logging road lit up with the bright, flashing red and blue lights of local law enforcement. Because Oakhaven was a small town, the response was massive and immediate. 4 police cruisers tore through the crushed iron security gates, sliding to a halt on the muddy lawn. Heavily armed officers rushed the porch shouting commands, their flashlights cutting through the storm. Arthur slowly backed away, raising his hands, allowing the officers to pull Sela's thorn off the wooden deck. They aggressively secured his arms behind his back with heavy steel handcuffs and dragged him toward the waiting police cruisers. Once the weapon was secured and the suspect was in custody, a female police officer kicked open the locked kitchen door from the outside, shattering the wooden frame, and stepped inside to clear the house. Arthur stood on the rain-soaked porch, breathing heavily, his entire body trembling from the adrenaline. He looked through the splintered doorway into the warm, bright kitchen. Caroline was standing there. She dropped the black phone receiver, letting it dangle by its cord. She was covered in small cuts from the shattered window glass, and she looked exhausted, terrified, and incredibly beautiful. For a moment, neither of them moved. They just stared at each other, the reality of the moment completely overwhelming their senses. It was a bridge across 2 decades of agonizing separation. Then Arthur took a step forward. Caroline broke into a desperate, sprinting run. She flew through the broken doorway, crashing into Arthur's chest with a force that nearly knocked them both over. Arthur wrapped his arms tightly around her, burying his face in her silver-streaked hair. He held her as if she would disappear if he let go even for a second. Caroline completely collapsed against him, sobbing with a deep, agonizing, and entirely beautiful release of pain. She gripped the back of his coat, crying his name over and over again into his shoulder. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, his own hot tears mixing with the freezing coastal rain on his face. He felt the familiar warmth of her, the way she perfectly fit into his arms, and the devastating, crushing weight of 21 years of ambiguous loss finally lifted entirely off his soul. They stood there in the pouring rain, holding each other tightly, while the flashing police lights illuminated the dark Washington forest around them. By sunrise the next morning, the small, isolated property was completely swarming with federal agents. When the local Oakhaven police looked inside the massive steel warehouse, they immediately realized this was completely out of their jurisdiction. The Federal Bureau of Investigation took over the entire compound. The FBI dismantled Sela's Thorne's multi-million-dollar forgery empire piece by piece. They cataloged hundreds of fake historical documents, thousands of vintage, blank antique pages, and a massive arsenal of illegal printing chemicals. They also seized his financial records, discovering millions of dollars hidden in offshore bank accounts. Sela's Thorne was heavily indicted on massive federal charges, including kidnapping, extortion, grand larceny, and federal fraud. Because of the overwhelming physical evidence in the warehouse, and Arthur's corroborating testimony about the fake Pennsylvania driver's license from 1994, Caroline was treated purely as a hostage. She was completely cleared of any criminal wrongdoing regarding the forgery ring or the stolen identity. The FBI investigators listened to her story in absolute awe, deeply moved by the incredible sacrifice a young wife had made to protect her husband from a violent criminal. It took weeks of exhausting legal interviews, medical checkups, and paperwork before Arthur and Caroline were finally allowed to leave Washington state. On a bright, crisp morning in late December, they boarded a commercial flight together and flew back home to Holland, Michigan. When they pulled into the driveway of their small craftsman house, the neighborhood was covered in a beautiful, fresh layer of winter snow. It looked exactly as it had on the night of their 3rd wedding anniversary. Caroline stood on the sidewalk for a long time, staring at the front door, tears quietly falling down her cheeks. She had spent over 7,000 nights locked in a dark warehouse on the other side of the country, dreaming of this exact front porch. Arthur gently took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and walked her up the front steps. He unlocked the heavy wooden door and they stepped inside. The house was warm, quiet, and perfectly preserved. Arthur had never changed a single thing. He walked Caroline into the living room and asked her to stand by the fireplace. He reached up to the wooden mantel and carefully opened the small glass display box. He took out the delicate silver anniversary locket. Caroline looked at the jewelry, crying softly as she remembered the absolute terror of the night she had unclasped it. Arthur stepped behind her, gently brushing her silver hair out of the way. With steady, loving hands, he placed the silver chain around her neck and securely fastened the clasp. The locket rested perfectly against her chest, exactly where it was always meant to be. The story of the young wife who vanished after her anniversary dinner, only to be found 21 years later because of a viral video, became a massive national news phenomenon. The media was completely captivated by the incredible odds of a husband recognizing a subtle nervous habit, tapping a book spine 3 times, on a random internet video. It was a story that felt completely impossible, a cinematic miracle born out of pure, devoted observation. Silas Thorne, an old man stripped of his wealth and his power, was sentenced to life in federal prison. He died behind bars just 3 years later, utterly alone, entirely forgotten by the world he had tried to manipulate. But for Arthur and Caroline Pendelton, the media attention slowly faded, and they were finally allowed to simply live. It was not a perfect, instantly easy transition. The trauma of 21 years of captivity required deep patience, professional therapy, and gentle understanding. There were nights when Caroline would wake up in a panic, terrified that she was back in the steel warehouse. But every single time, Arthur was right there beside her, holding her hand, gently reminding her that she was safe, that the doors were locked, and that she was finally home. Their story stands as a beautiful, profound testament to the enduring power of true devotion. It is a reminder that evil men can steal time, they can forge documents, and they can build heavy iron gates to hide their crimes in the dark. But they can never forge the genuine, unbreakable bond of love. Love remembers the exact sound of a laugh. It remembers the way a hand taps against a book. And most importantly, love never, ever stops searching, proving that even after decades of absolute silence, the truth will always find a way to bring you back home.